Hello, everybody. Welcome to Spotlight with Sandhya. And this is the second episode of our new series called Leadership Decoded. At Raintree Media, we interact with a lot of leaders, founders from various fields, and we help them document their life stories and their leadership journey. And today, it's a great honor and pleasure for me as a International Women's Day event to have an exceptional leader here with me, Geeta Panda.
Thank you.
And I want to say that Raintree Media is also working with Geeta on documenting her leadership journey. It's part of our new series called C-Suite Publishing, and the book should be out later this year. Geeta has 30 years of experience in transforming businesses, leading teams, and heading industry forums. She built her career across India's defining industries. Often, she was the only woman in the room. Today, she'll share with us the leadership skills that nobody talks about. Let's welcome Geeta Panda. And thank you so much, Geeta. You know, you've been in so many sectors. You've been in IT, you've been in shipping, you've been in biotech, you've been in banking, pharma, and now you're with a startup. This gives you a very unique perspective, how Indian companies go global and how global companies grow in India. The flavor of the moment is all about GCCs. Can you tell us what are the opportunities available for people in this sector?
Yeah, thanks, Sandhya, for that question. I think very, very pertinent considering that we are in the middle of trying to understand the requirements and grow our GCC sector. One of the things I'd really come and talk about the growth in a bit, but I think there are three critical factors, and I usually say that growth is not about bringing in business once and failing and sending it back. It's about building ongoing loyalty, ongoing sustainability. And for that, I think there are about three components that I believe are extraordinarily critical for us to brainstorm and crack them right at the beginning before we actually start bringing in that work. We know there are a lot of organizations globally that are very keen to come to our country and make this happen. The first thing that I would say is real estate is a very, very crucial topic. The second one, on the skill and the competency development and what are we going to do about it. And the third, which is the most critical one, is about energy, space, and consumption. Now, I'll go one at a time and explain what do we need to do in each one of these areas to build a sustainable, loyal model. First, when we talk about bringing in real estate, when I say real estate, it's not about setting up a building and with world-class facilities, but it should be at a location where skills are available, competencies are available, where we can provide adequate safety, and it is not prone to any major natural calamities like flooding and because this is a 24/7 operation, so you have to really brainstorm and think through where you want to actually place these centers that can be in a sustainable model. That's one, and it has to obviously be cost effective from a real estate standpoint. The second one is skill and competency. I think this is one area where I feel hands down we can beat people, we can just invest, train, certify, and make sure that our guys are really thriving and flourishing and performing. And we have done that over and over and over again, and we can do it again. So that's not a problem. The third one, which is actually the one that we really need to crack, is on the energy piece. When we are talking of setting up AI data centers across, I mean, it consumes a lot of energy, space, and a whole lot of infrastructure. Now, if we are going to do that, there are also going to be organizations that have already come to India which are into standard IT computing model and which are in that journey. They're still not where they want to be from a GCC standpoint, move into AI model, and so on and so forth. So now if the energy consumption is going to be provided all over to the GCCs that are starting up, what happens to the standard computing companies that we already have committed to? Will that become cost unviable for them to be with us, or what is it? We need to really brainstorm and think about it. And the last bit, which is even more critical here, is we are not losing the business that we are bringing home. So therefore, are we thinking of nuclear energy? Are we thinking of alternate energy models? And I'm sure there is a lot of thought process thinking that CII and NASSCOM, everywhere that I go, they're all brainstorming for ideas and opportunities that may be prevalent. So we are kind of, we've got to set it up right. We have to make sure that these three components are very, very seriously taken. And we do not bring them because we want to bring them. We want to bring them as loyal organizations who will want to live and be here with us, and then the entire livelihood gets impacted. The moment you have a GCC, you have real estate booming, you have employee opportunities, right from plumbing jobs to all the way up to CEOs. You will have a series of opportunities that kind of.
That's good to know, because I think it's good that our top talent stays back in our country rather than go and be at the mercy of changing visa laws and H-1B visas and all the geographical uncertainties that are happening everywhere. I want to talk now about the leaders you've observed. You must have worked with leaders who have transformed organizations. So where do they get their strength from? Is it something that they learn on the job, or is it something that they try to develop themselves from within before going out to the job?
So I think the strength for anyone, particularly for all successful leaders that I see, certain traits are very common. Strength is from within. I mean, there is enormous amount of strength that we as individuals, we as human beings, we as women, we as men carry within ourselves. And that is very, very prevalent with strong leaders. It's about their self strength that they bring to the table. The other common traits that I normally notice, in every single leader that has actually been part of major transformations that I've worked with, they are innovators. They want to be the first to go and make that happen. They are not followers. They will not follow something that someone else is doing. They would want to kind of be different. Their thinking will be unique. It will be way ahead of the time that they are in. That is one. Humility, because they're willing to go and sit down at the lowest level and understand what's happening in the ground, on the ground, the realities, and how they could fix those issues. So there is utmost focus on innovation, great humility, high ethics. Okay, what they say is what they do. What they do is what they say. Okay, so walking the talk all the time. You will never find a leader that is transformative, that is powerful, that's strong, waver from some of these fundamental behaviors. Authentic in what they communicate and what they want to achieve. Very, very scientific and data-based, very fact-based. It's not, I heard this, I said this. No, show me where it's happening and how it's happening and where can we make a difference. That's the kind of conversations that they end up having. So these are very, very common behaviors that I have noticed in number of leaders, and I have imbibed in myself many of these qualities to be successful, and I have enabled that down below across all my organizations, and I've seen them thrive, flourish, changes, manage all kinds of adversities and get past it and still thrive and survive and do extraordinarily well. So that's really the common trait.
Tell me the one thing that you've learned that no one taught you, that you learned on your own.
Yeah, see, what we learn on our own is that we don't expect any adversities in our life, but we know that every step in the way, either personally or work-wise, we are going to see some adverse incidents coming and hitting us, and we are never prepared for it, right? We always believe that it's never going to happen. It's going to be smooth sailing. We have a plan and we are going ahead with the plan and we are going to deliver to the plan. What we don't get taught or what we don't plan for is the adversities, and I think we try to navigate and we work through those adversities and thereby become a resilient leader, right? So we not only deliver to our outcomes and our plans and our objectives, we also know how to manage adversities and become resilient over a period of time.
That's really interesting. And that's something I think that all of us can take away from here. Every time that there is an unexpected problem or some setback, you think, oh, why me? Why did it happen to me? I was doing everything. But this is a new thing that you use it as a stepping stone. Okay, so, as a leader, you probably had to make several tough calls. And I find that when there's no clear answer that this is right and this is wrong, it's really difficult to take a call. How do you manage that?
See, when you get to a point of leadership, there is no right, there is no wrong. You really align yourself with your personal vision of what you want to be and where you want to be thriving and what you want to be known for, right? So that becomes the priority. So rights and wrongs are very individualistic. What actually troubles me is, when I'm trying to get business to India and migrate work to India or migrate work from one European location to another European location, I know I'm impacting hundreds of families in one location, and I'm kind of moving that work to another location which is going to benefit. The location that is getting impacted, that's something that's emotional and that's about people, and it's the touch and feel that bothers me. So what I do, while the vision of the organization, the mission and the dream that the company has in terms of financials become your priority as an employee because you're getting paid for doing that. However, I go the extra mile to go and talk to the human resource in the respective countries when I'm migrating. I also make sure that they are aligned with a lot of those organizations which are still in the hiring mode in those countries, and I kind of reach out to all the CEOs and big organizations that are hiring personally to ensure that our guys who are getting laid off are actually getting an opportunity to work elsewhere. And I try my level best to do that. I don't get paid for it, but it's an emotional impact that I'm trying to avoid by doing that. And when you lay off employees, whether it's in India or in the US or in the Europe, the trauma is the same, because you're doing something that's impacting families, children, senior citizens, educated mass, and it can be very, very troubling. And that bothered me more than, someone not giving me the right direction. I know I can find my way and I can go and do it. But, these are things that actually kept me awake, I would say.
That's a very, very humane aspect of leadership that you brought about, and that's something that we should all think about as we are forced to take tough decisions with the economy going through so many ups and downs. So you were talking about how you groom leaders. How obviously mentorship plays a very important role. So could you share an experience where a mentor guided you through your journey?
I've had all my leaders have been my mentors, and I've always believed in one thing. I've seen a lot of youngsters come and tell me in many of my discussions, one-on-ones or skip levels or anything. I think I know better than what my leader knows. And they probably are not so hands-on as I am, and they don't understand. And I always tell you need to believe that your leader is where they are for a reason, which is because they are better than you, and that's why you have a leader. So I always believed that. And when I worked with my leaders, some of the things that they really coached me was one, I can talk of an Irish leader. I've worked with many Irish leaders, and one of them taught me how to be a salesperson. I'm actually a very, very operations focused person, and I'm very I know my boundaries. I know I don't like talking, selling and stuff. I like to go get my work done and stuff. But he made me sell the largest deal that HP ever signed, which was $1 billion contract with an oil and gas company. So that's how leaders kind of move you away from that belief that you have that you do certain things very well and you're extraordinary, and you don't leave, you always keep playing to your strengths, right? You don't show your weaknesses. So your weak point is that you can't go out and sell, and he said, I'll put you right there, and now you demonstrate that you can do it, and you did it, right? So that's how mentors should be. If you know that there is an opportunity for someone who cannot read a, say, annual report, for example, but a hardcore IT strategist, you pull them aside and say, okay, how do you read an annual report? What are the points that you look at when you look at an annual report? And it's a huge document. So what are the key components that you have to look at? So, that's how, I started mentoring, and I mentor a lot of leaders, a lot of senior officials. And, I catch hold of a point where I feel they need to kind of invest in that particular area. I don't touch about the topics that I know they are very, very conversant with. If it's an IT manager, I know he's great in IT and therefore is in an IT job. If there is something else that is lacking, so for that equation to connect with a mentor and to make them understand your point of view, you first need to connect with people. Once you connect with people, you can start correcting them. You cannot start correcting upfront and say, these are your flaws, and, put them on a defense. So you first start connecting with them, you understand where they come from, get down to their level and understand their points of view, their agreements and disagreements, and then slowly start engaging them in, growth related topics. So it's a very invigorating and very motivating thing for me personally to kind of interact with all genres and all generations of people. It kind of, and sometimes they say I'm very partial to Gen Z, I'm very partial to senior citizens, I'm very partial to the millennials, but I'm actually partial to all, because I learn from everyone.
That means that you devote a lot, you invest a lot of your time and energy in this, and I'm glad you find it invigorating. But I think that's one of the key leadership lessons, to invest in empathizing with the team before you expect them to produce great results. That's a really interesting point. Now I want to talk about a question that's been on my mind for a while. You see a lot of companies invest very heavily in digital transformation, but then so many of those efforts fail to improve customer satisfaction. So you've been on both sides. So can you tell us where the shortfall happens?
Yeah, so typically, if we look at the CXO, which is the customer experience officer or whatever they are called now, that position never existed. It was either a CIO or a CTO. And a CTO and a CIO are hardcore technologists. And what happens is their organization looks at some real cool softwares and tools and technology stuff that they believe is going to be a huge win for them if they go out and implement them. So there is heavy investment. They go around and roll it over to, say, 110,000 employees in a large organization, and the uptake is not there. Nobody wants to go there, nobody wants to check, and they're still calling the service desk and they call contact center for basic needs, and the whole purpose gets diluted. First thing is, I think we never understood why we are implementing something. Therefore, we evolved now, and we are now talking design thinking, where we are sitting with a bunch of users, understanding what their needs are. Earlier on, we also built models which were like, one shoe fits all. There is one product and everybody uses that, and it may not be relevant for everyone. For example, you go into a factory environment or a sales environment or a marketing environment, or an office person who's sitting and working in an office environment. Their needs are different, their requirements are different, their challenges are different, the dynamics are different. Now, if you give them one product and say use it all, it never works. So therefore, customization and, building personas based on a particular profile becomes very, very important. And then when you actually deploy a tool or or anything, you see more uptake. You see a lot of people wanting to use it, because day one or ground zero, I would say, you involved them, you asked them what they want, and then you're giving it to them. So the chances of them declining to use it or not using it becomes rare at that point, right? So you've taken their inputs, they've said we want it, and then you've given it to them. And that's when the delight really happens. And experience is not about satisfaction, it's about delighting the customers, making them absolutely very, very happy, heard, and that's a very soft feeling, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, suppose you enter a struggling organization and you have 30 days to fix it. Where would you start?
Depends on where we are struggling. Is it the operations? Is it the sales organization? Is it the end user that is struggling? Depending on where. And I don't commit to a date when I actually take an escalated account. I do my due diligence. I look at objective data. I evaluate the teams that are delivering to those outcomes, and then come up with a cohesive plan which is agreeable both from a client side as well as from our side. For example, we had a very, very large high profile account that came as part of one of our acquired organizations in one of my companies that I worked. Huge customer, right? Tremendously high profile, Fortune 1 or Fortune 2 in terms of the size of the organization. And we were blood red in all the metrics that we signed up for, the service level agreement that we had. We were paying millions of dollars every month in the form of penalties. And I was just brought out of nowhere and thrown right there and told, you meet the CIOs and the CEOs of that organization and fix this problem for me. And I went there, and the moment I walked in, there was this very hostile look that I got from all of them from the client side. And there were people from the other organization which had acquired that company, and I was the only one coming from the parent organization. I was sitting there. I was trying to calm down the situation. I called for some coffee, and then I started off by talking about the values and the vision and mission we had as an organization. And I was shut down, and I was told, you shut up, you're none of these things, you're not good enough. You have never demonstrated any of these things after we signed the contract, and it's been 8 months and we're ready to pull it out, and you have precisely this much time. And I said, I'd like to stop here. I would still want you to hear what my vision, what my mission, my organization is meant, and what we have done and what we will continue to do. And then I told them, if you expect me to swing a magic wand and change the situation in 30 days, let me tell you, it's not going to happen. You can take this and go somewhere else, but you're going to have the same problem, because you're taking a problem and going away. You're not taking a clean shop and walking out of. So I said, this is my plan. It's going to take 30, 60, 90. I have a 30-day plan. I have a 60-day plan. I have a 90-day plan. In 6 months, I will be green. But in 6 months, I know I will bleed so many millions of dollars, but I will beat my service level contracts to such an extent that you will have to start paying me incentives, and I'll recover all of that in the next 2 years. Everything that I've paid and beyond, I will ensure that comes back to me in 2 years. They were like, they thought it was a tall promise, let's go with it. And I said, for 6 months, don't even come and complain about green CSLs. It's not going to happen. I'm calling it out upfront. There is going to be more noise, and believe me that it's going to get worse before it gets better. So, we have to be prepared, and we call out the problem right up front. We are honest, we are earnest in resolving the problem, and we are going in the right direction. And we are periodic reviews. We have shown progress week on week, month on month. And on the 5th month, I was green. And and not only just green, I was also exceeding my committed service level agreements, and I was getting them to pay me incentives, because it works both ways. When they are penalizing you for failing, they also pay you or incentivize you for overperforming. So that's how I've handled all the escalations, and I'm known to be an escalation expert. Unfortunately, when there is a fire,
Not a firefighter.
firefighter, they would just drop me there, and I would go there and try and address that. But the fact that I had the courage to go upfront and tell what is factual, what is really happening on the ground, and what is going to change, and be very open and transparent about the mess that we have created, and acknowledging and empathizing with the customer on their current challenges and how they are managing their businesses, and the business leaders is something that that they appreciate in the long run.
Fantastic. I think owning the problem and not evading responsibility, and having the dedication to see.
Having the courage to tell that, yes, I messed up.
That's very important.
That's so important.
Right. Because, I mean, there are mess ups. People are human, and companies are led by humans. So there are errors, I guess. Okay, now I want to talk more about being a woman in the workplace. Much as I wish that we didn't have to have one day for women and every day could be equally for women and men, we do have to have this conversation. Only about 30% of the capable, employable women join the workforce. And we see so many young people here, and how many of them actually stay on or even move up the career? The percentage is way, way less. The crucial issue, however, is not about the number of women. It's actually how do they get to exercise the decision-making power in whatever organization they are in, which is where you, as a woman leader in various organizations, you can share your thoughts. Are there any unwritten rules that women should pick up on that we don't know, that we have to learn these things to be able to move up?
The unwritten rule for anybody, irrespective of who they are, whether they are men or women or any individual, I think the unwritten rule is, I want to be doing what I want to be doing, right? Nobody can make me do things that I don't want to do. You can give enormous amount of opportunities, you can give everything that you want for people to come and work, but they may still choose not to work. So that's a choice that you make. Therefore, what actually is critical for a man, for a woman, for anybody that is professional, is the passion that is within them to make it happen. There is no unwritten rule. The unwritten rule is, I want to be known for doing this. I want to be known for delivering to these outcomes. I want to be known and seen as a leader. And then what you do is you also enable an ecosystem around you that is also believing that they all have to contribute and support to your own vision and dream of where you want to be. For example, if you're a lady and you're newly married, you have a baby, and you have a job that is very, very taxing and time consuming and takes you places and all of that, you still have a household, you have a family to take care of and other things. You build the ecosystem in such a way that your void is getting addressed at home by someone else, and you are enabling that. You are enabling and empowering those resources to support you in the manner that you want, rather than I've noticed a lot of us feeling guilty for not being at home, guilty for not making that cup of coffee for your child, or I'm saying, if you want to be doing something and your vision for yourself is to do something other than staying at home, then, don't feel guilty about things that are not doing so well at home. You could have probably maintained your home in a lot different and a better manner, and you could have run the household in a better manner if you were actually at home. That's okay. Come to terms with that. You know, you're because that's not your priority. Your priority of who you want to be is different. You can choose that my home is my priority, right? So, and I'm going to do an extraordinary job in raising my kid. I'm going to do an extraordinary job of being a homemaker, host, taking care of my family, and that's a very, very good thought and a very good option as well, right? But when you step out and have a different vision, don't feel guilty that some area where you're supposed to be, you're not there, and that's not doing as well as you want it to be. Don't feel guilty about it. You know, for a long time, I never made a cup of coffee for myself. I mean, it was 10 years or 15 years ago when I started actually making a cup of coffee for my own self. And the first fear after my mom passed away, everyone had was, Geetu doesn't know how to make a cup of coffee for herself, and how is she going to survive? How is she going to wake up in the morning? Right? So, but that was not my priority. I never learned how to make a cup of coffee. I would go to a vending machine and get a cup of coffee for myself. So, you know, there was this big joke in the environment that I was working, that I was always told, you know, someone has to get her a coffee, otherwise she cannot make a coffee for herself. But that's okay. I mean, I don't feel guilty about not doing that. You know, I let it go, and I got to learn it when I knew I have to learn it, right? So that's how we need to kind of come to terms with what we believe is not our priority, and we should be okay with it, and we should not feel guilty about it.
So I think women should start getting over this superwoman complex that we have to be the best mom, the best employee, the best wife, the best mother, best at everything. I think that's what the one that actually trips us up and makes us carry this big load of guilt. Okay, you know, another thing where we women are very hesitant is in negotiating salaries and perks. How did you handle your negotiations?
Yeah, so I think pretty early in my career, very early in my career, I think 5 years into my work life or 7 years into my work life, I made myself so larger than my own name and stuff that, you know, wherever I walked in, I knew that I could transform, I could make a difference, I could impact, and people across industries started knowing and noticing, and then, you know, your brand becomes bigger than who you are, and your reputation becomes a lot bigger than you know, what you think it is, right? So your reputation in the business circle can drive you to become a better negotiator. I have actually never negotiated. I have just dictated you know, what I want. When it comes to you know, compensation, when it comes to rewards and recognition, not just for me, but for my entire organization, I would first qualify that I will overachieve / all of these metrics that you're giving me, but I will not fit my guys into your bell curve. 10% will get this, 70% will be the mass, 20%, don't put them in those numbers and those buckets. My team is unique, they're special, they will deliver to things that you will not notice anyone doing across the organization, and therefore, you know, I'm not going to compromise on the standard fitments and the standard rules that apply for the rest of the company. So, you know, it was not only about me, it was about my entire team that I would walk in and dictate those terms well ahead in time and get past that. So it's been a long time since I've sat on the table and said, you know, I think you should increase my compensation by 10% or 15%. I've never, I mean, I would just throw a number that comes very wildly and believe that, you know, if they feel that I'm important enough, they would come and hire me, and it would be a wild number, you know, and that's really how I approached, you know, my compensation. But while it was an important thing for me, I never worked for compensation. I worked because I wanted to be there. I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to bring in innovation. I wanted to let a lot of people learn from a lot of the thing. Compensation, I think, is a byproduct, and it comes on its own. At some point, you know, you really don't have to negotiate. There are people who are willing to get you for a price that you may not know your own worth, right?
Good. That's something that all of us can take away. And I think my contract is coming up with some clients. I'm going to try my luck. So you've been a woman leading teams mostly with, men in your team. Did you experience any pushback?
Actually, Sandhya, the problem was that I was always told that though I'm a woman, I'm hiring a lot of men and I'm not hiring enough women in my team. So there was no pushback from the men on my team. Yes, in the initial phases of my career, when I moved into the IT organization, I did see some patriarchy. I did see some people uncomfortable with my vocal and a very vociferous personality. But I think over a period of time, people got used to it, and they started accepting more of it, and it went away. My team, I have not seen anyone having any kind of resistance because I'm a lady or a woman, and they would want it any other way. So I did not see that in my team, but I did see at my peer levels some discomfort, and at senior levels in India, particularly in some places. But I think you choose to ignore things that you don't believe in, right? So, and you keep going, and you don't stop anywhere. And if you feel it's really getting to a point where it's not helpful, or it's not giving you that positive vibe, there are organizations like there are HR and the secret organization, the ombudsman or whatever they used to call in those days, who could do an investigation and kind of give them feedback discreetly and close it. But there are avenues, and we have to knock on those avenues and kind of leverage support if there is a requirement, but never compromise on what you believe in, what is right, and do the right things irrespective of whether it's getting you fame or not. I mean, at the end of it, I think it'll all work out.
Do you have any advice for men about working with women leaders, since there are more women now climbing up into the leadership position?
I think that disparity of I am a man and I need the patriarchy that we used to talk about doesn't prevail anymore, Sandhya. I think it's all because the organization policies are all so stringent. Whether it's an Indian organization, whether it's a startup, you look at it, I mean, it's all, everything is equal. Nobody can really actually think they are above one another. Even hierarchy. For example, if I'm the CEO, that doesn't mean I can talk as I like with somebody else who is my employee. I mean, people don't take it. Gender it's over. It's kind of so eliminated now from discussions, because it's all one organization, one rule that applies, and the policies are very, very favoring, and a lot more favorable for women to kind of, from a biological standpoint, if they need support, help, the organizations are a lot more understanding, and they're building all that cost into their framework, and and honestly, these topics would have been very pertinent 20 years ago, where we actually saw those stubbornly patriarchal environments, and then we suddenly saw that everything was gone.
But maybe this is the fact in the corporate world. This is not so in other industries. So maybe there's some room for growth even there. Another thing that I've noticed you doing in your industry forum is you advocate for women who have taken career breaks to come back to the workforce. What's the biggest barrier they face, and how can they push past it?
The biggest barrier is the women themselves, Sandhya. See, what happens, I always persuade people, while they are in their intermediate and when they're going into a professional college, I ask people to visualize what they want to be, where they want to be. What do they want to be? An engineer? Do they want to be an expert in marketing? Do they want to build startups? And go and admit themselves, or they want to be a homemaker, go and admit themselves into those areas that are very, very focused on their likings and their passion and their commitment. Women become engineers because they want to be married in better families. Women become doctors and don't practice. See, now what's happening in the process is someone who's really passionate about being in a medical profession or being an engineer loses the opportunity of getting into those colleges, and you're occupying the seats and you're actually not doing the job, and you're doing a disservice to the community, to the people who are capable of providing that service to this thing. So what I say is, do what you want, but select and become that from day one. Do not occupy engineering seats if you're not going to be in a technical field and you want to be a homemaker. Go and do courses that can make you the best there. And I have no problems with anyone choosing any kind of profession they want. I'm saying relevance to education should be in that direction rather than anything else. And women, when they say that they want to take a break, they are expecting a baby and they do not want to come back to work for 5 years, they want to be at home. The first question I ask, and which really worries me, is how much do you have in terms of a bank balance? Is my first question. Do you have enough to sustain yourself, and do you want to be dependent on your spouse, and is it okay, is it a joint decision that you guys are choosing that there will be one person winning bread and the other person focusing on the home? That's a fine model too, but do you understand what you're getting into? Most cases women did not even have a lakh of rupees in the bank, and they're ready to take a 5-year break. And I'm saying, then you're going to be miserable. You're going to feel very bad. You've been independent financially. So make a very conscious decision when you're taking that break. And when you take a break, you also decide when you want to come back to work. Don't say that for 20 years, I'm going to be on a break. Say I'm going to be on a break for 5 years. And this 5 years, this is how I'm going to sustain my own self, and I'm going to take care of myself and my family and do this. And then when I come back to work, then I'm still relevant, right? Because if I say I'm going to take a 20-year break and come back, then will I be relevant at that point? Will my skills of today be relevant at that point? I don't think the skills that I acquired 4 years ago is relevant today. So, we are in that kind of an environment. So we really need to be thoughtful and mindful. And that's my coaching, and that's my ask of all the people, women and even men are wanting to take breaks now, which is a great thing. But I say, make a very conscious decision, because, you're going to be financially dependent on somebody. You're going to be emotional for the entire family, and you're going to hold up to all the emotional needs of your family. So you should be emotionally strong and determined. So those are some of the things that that become very, very unrealistic for women to come back to work, or someone who's taken a long break to come back, because the relevance is becoming a problem.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think that's something, like you said, both the couple or the individual both have to take a decision. It's a risk. Think it through. And I think these days it could be easier for reskilling even when they are at home, or take up some gig work. So there are lots of more opportunities. Over these 30 years that you've been there in so many different companies and in various roles, were there times that when you felt like giving up? And how did you get past those challenging moments?
There has never been a time where I felt like giving up because of burnout or anything, because simply I would take my breaks, I would engage with my family, friends, very, very periodically. I would go on my vacations, I would do whatever I wanted to do as an individual. I loved painting, I would paint, I would do everything that I wanted to do. The only time I wanted to take a break was, when I finished some 3 or 4 mergers with Hewlett Packard Inc. And, I was wanting to take a break. And then when Novartis came, opportunity came, I saw a big opportunity for India. I saw a big opportunity for leader, because I was the first woman leader at the top level that they were hiring out of a country outside of US or Europe. So that became a very big driver for me to go back and join them. But yes, I did take a short break for health reasons, and I also wanted to ensure that my son was getting married and settling down. So, it was a very conscious, known, short gap that I took before I got back and joined my startup company of my brothers. And, so that short break was definitely planned to regain some health challenges that I was faced with, and also bring my, bring some, focus on my son's life, and get that sorted. And it was a very, very personal decision for a very short period, and then I got back again.
I think this has been a very, very interesting session. Thank you, Geeta, for all these wonderful insights. And I think the leadership lesson that we are walking away is that the leadership skill that begins with self-belief. And with that, I invite the audience to ask some questions if they want
What is
to.
your push statement for women? Because there is equal number of women in business, but they are not going out there pushing themselves to ask money from the market, from the investors. So when we went ahead, did further investigation, they feel more responsible for that money. They feel guilty if they are not able to pay it back. But men don't do that. Men just take decisions and jump into it. So what is your one push statement for women to just go all out there and do what they
Yeah, it goes back. See, women generally are a little risk averse. Risk taking is something that men are better at compared to what we are always very conservative, planning. We are focused in not getting into a debt situation, not getting into any kind of financial mess and this thing. But now I think it's dramatically changing. If you look at the Shark Tanks and the investments that are going, it's all going for women entrepreneurs. Quite a lot of people who are making clothing, and it's moving in that direction. Yeah, are we seeing? Yes.
Stop you. Data is very scary, that 1% to match the 100%. This happened in 2025 November, so not very long back. So the numbers are very, very disappointing. So somewhere there has to be a push that to go all out and then pitch what I would say. So do you think this is the reason, or women are not actually getting the investment?
No, I don't believe we are approaching enough to get the investment. That should be the the first premise that we work on. Are we actually going out there and saying, can you invest? And I think that is where we are having the issue. It's not because I'm a woman that I'm not getting the investment. That's probably a different narrative. The narrative is that I do not want, I have 10 lakhs and I know I can make this a 12 lakh or a 15 lakh in 12 months on my own, and I don't want to make this 10 lakhs by borrowing another 10 lakhs into a 50 lakh venture. I'm not envisioning something like that, and that's the problem. And I think a lot of organizations like women focused networking organizations are pushing really hard for people to reimagine the way they imagined their own businesses, and not just be there with your own money, but also kind of go out there and start. It's not going to change overnight. In 25, if we are saying that 1 against 100, it's going to move some this year because we are seeing that happen. It is going to move some more next year, and by 28 you can see at least the single digit going away and it moving into it. So that's how the transition is going to happen. So if I expect that today I'm kind of marketing and pushing and doing all of that, it's going to change tomorrow. It's not. It's going to take us at least another 3 years to move the single digit into a double-digit number, and then you'll see more and more of people coming and following that. That's my prediction.
And I want to tell you, Aparna, there are several VC groups which are funded by women angel investors. They want to invest in women-led businesses. So you should spread out cast your net wide and get over that resistance. Like she said, that's something that all of us struggle with initially, saying, oh, I just need, if I'm getting 10 lakh, I'll be okay if I get 25 lakhs. But why aren't we thinking of crores? But you have to work on it.
What is the disruption that you see in the near future for industry in general and GCC in particular?
Yeah, the disruption is AI, right? We all know that is the biggest disruption that we are faced with today. And AI is, I mean, we are doing well. We are, our AI model seems to be working well, particularly when it came to our defense and when we had the Operation Sindoor and all of that. We were able to intercept, and it was all because of AI. However, at the ground level, are we having sufficient talent that can actually build AIs? We do not have that capability to the extent that we want it to be. And we heard that in the AI summit that happened recently in Delhi from the biggies like Pichais of the world. So we need to really scale up on that front, and that's the biggest disruption that's going on right now across the board. It's everywhere, so that's the biggest disruption, and that's where we need to put in all our energy to build the skills up.
I just wanted to know what's the India story as well.
India story for GCC, as I said, we have tremendous amount of trust that we are seeing from large organizations globally. They are extremely keen to make big investments in India. They know the talent that we are. They know the capabilities we have. We just have to be mindful of the 3 points that I talked about earlier on, and we have to ensure that we are not bringing in that business because there's someone who is believing in us and sending it to us, but we are actually developing a loyalty there by putting it and setting it up the right way the first time. And if there is one failure there with one large corporation, they are going to lose it all. So, we need to be very mindful of the fact that today the world is completely trusting us on our skills, capabilities, our engineers, our logistics, our real estate, everything. But one failure can cost us the entire business. And that's how seriously each of us in the business have to take it.
So there's a lot riding on it, I guess. And I think that we come to an end of this session. If there are any more, you can continue the discussions over coffee. I want to end with thanking you all for coming here today, and request you to follow our YouTube channel, share it, comment on it, like it, don't like it, let us know. And thank you, Geeta, for joining us today. Thank you, Rainmakers, for this.
Thank you everyone for joining. I really appreciate all of your time. Thank you.